Hi, welcome to today's Simulate webinar, What Your Controls Aren't Telling You. My name is Brian Moran. I lead product marketing here at Simulate, and I'm excited to have my esteemed colleague, Marcel Sokolovsky, join me here. So today's webinar is going to share some of Marcel's insights around how you can test, optimize, improve security effectiveness of your security controls. But to accomplish that, you can't just rely on what your controls tell you. So Marcel, welcome. Thanks for joining me for today's webinar.
Hi, Brian. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Talking a little bit about myself, I've been helping customers being successful in the security landscape for a couple of years now, and also helping them reduce risk, exposure, and I have some interesting stories to share today.
Yeah, that's why we have you, because you've got that hands-on experience of seeing how a control performs and helping guide our customers to take those incremental steps of how do I improve detection? How do I improve prevention? How do I prove what's working appropriately, right? So,
Exactly.
of course, the value of security validation. So again, love having you on webinars. I always learn something every time. So the idea behind today's webinar really kind of started with a LinkedIn post I saw from a controls auditor, security assessment consultant. He writes this open letter to Palo Alto, and he tags the Palo Alto CEO, as he should. And the gist of the open letter is this, that when he goes in for an audit, a risk assessment, he sees Palo Alto and says, hey, this company has invested in quality controls. They're going top of the line. They've gone for a leader in network security. In this case, of course, Palo does more than network security, but here they're highlighting a web app, a network, a next generation firewall, and say, hey, they've got good quality security controls. But after doing the assessment, you realize that not everything is turned on. That, of course, there's advanced security features that aren't being utilized. And then when you actually engage with the customer to say, hey, let's go, you should turn these on, the user is not even aware they exist. So he saw this trend of, hey, you've bought good security, you're not necessarily using good security up to its capabilities. So he said, hey, Palo Alto, it should be your responsibility, take some ownership to inform, educate, and get your customers to use what you sold them. Not unusual. So I like the idea of the letter, made a lot of sense to me. And then Palo Alto CEO responds. And hey, I love the proactive nature of receiving criticism. Yes, we should find a way of doing this. But he points the finger at the customer. The challenge is the customer. Marcel, in your time as customer support, customer success, how much success have you had pointing the finger at the customer saying it's a you problem?
well, well, I don't think the customer's to blame here, honestly. I think usually what we're seeing with the customers is sometimes they don't have the visibility or even the observability of those things. So when we talk about security control validation, I think it's an approach where you just need to understand and how your controls are behaving, and by running those assessments, like he mentioned on the post, right, is where you find those gaps and really understand exactly how exposed you are. So I really believe that having that visibility on the things that you have implemented and what are your current gaps are, you're definitely gonna find and provide the next steps for definitely some improvement.
So it may seem like we're calling out Palo Alto here. I definitely want to say they're not alone in this. Heck, I've probably worked at half the vendors that have had this mentality before. And when I saw 261 people like this response of pointing the finger back at the customer, I'm pretty sure half my old VPs of product were part of that liked. So the Palo Alto is not alone, but as an industry, we need to work together. Of okay, how do we get more use out of what we deployed, right?
Exactly.
So that's the idea behind this. What your controls aren't telling you, right? So you've invested in good security, but if we look at in reality, are our security controls, are they a single point of failure? We've built good security, we've purchased good security, but they don't always work as expected. right? And so some statistics we see of, from the IBM cost of a data breach report, 58% of breaches go unidentified by the internal teams and tools. There's a study by Deloitte that said, hey, on average, customers use about 20% of their overall cyber technology. Not great. And then when it comes to answering the critical question of, hey, am I secure? Can my controls stand up to this new threat? Generally, we see in our customers, it takes about 48 hours sometimes to just go, hey, I see a threat, I see a vulnerability, I see a new campaign. Am I ready for it? Can I defend myself against that? And of course, that's a pretty long window to not have that answer. So talking about security controls, the role of validation, and how can we get better, use what we have to be prepared for the next attack. So within those security controls, all because you have the control, again, doesn't necessarily mean it's tuned appropriately, right? Too often we see things like default configurations. Every control vendor is they're measured on how fast can I get you deployed, how fast, the time to value. But if you're only in default mode or you're not tuning it appropriately, is it really value, right? Of course, threats change. Threats will, what's tuned and appropriate for today may not be appropriate for the threat that comes tomorrow. And then we know our environments change. We know applications get updated. We know, we have to make exceptions for certain applications, certain environments. Your environment changes. We may not be aware that your security controls are no longer covering those.
Yep.
I mean, Marcel, so defaults, threats, environments, this is everyday kind of stuff our customers have to deal with, right?
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes customers, they don't have the complete knowledge of new servers coming in, being deployed, being pushed to production, going live, and already exposed to the internet and exposed to new threats. And even like you mentioned with the default configurations, just to make sure that it gets to production quicker. But, it's really complicated when you talk about shadow IT and how the best practice come in place, and with the rules that you have, the policies, and even when we're talking about the threat scenario, like the threat landscape or an incomplete threat modeling scenario where you're looking for new threats being evolved, and you have to know your attack surface, right? So you have the business context, but you also have to know where you're exposed, your industry, and what's the surface. And what is extremely important to understand also is your attack path. So once the network is reached, how you're going to get, and it's not sometimes a single attack, it's even a multi-stage attack, and even threat actors use different vectors for attack. So you have to make sure that your controls are in place and configured the best way possible.
Excellent. Okay, so let's get to the meat of the presentation where, what your controls aren't telling you, right? Again, if you've made the investments in best of breed endpoint, or maybe you consolidated around a single vendor, you still need the answer of, how effective are they? Am I prepared? So I got this idea of, again, a few questions that your controls aren't telling you. So number one, your controls will never tell you when you're not following best practices. Let's just start with the basics, right? How often do we see our customers say, I thought I was blocking that. I thought I had that. It's not as uncommon as we like, right?
Yeah. So I've been talking a lot with customers, and ransomware is really something that is, big. And we're seeing in the news how many groups, how many attacks that have been deployed, and they're successful in a lot of ways. And they're usually exploiting a vulnerability. And once they breach the network, they deploy the campaign, and really also trying to deploy, bypass and evasion techniques so they can stay dormant on the network and not be detected for some time for persistence. And so you have to make sure that you're looking at the old ones as well. So sometimes these attacks usually they resurface with new techniques or even using old ones. They are still not detected by your current controls, right? And also trying to send phishing emails that we've seen exploded with billions and billions of attempts to making the customer click on a malicious link or open a malicious payload or attachment, right? And then even convincing the customer to run code on your laptop. So it really evolves with social engineering and a lot of stuff. So we had to make sure that the control evolves as well. So we know that the threat actors will evolve faster and further, but we also have to make sure that the controls are evolving and are being efficient and effective to not allow any malicious content on the network.
Right. So, you see these common control gaps every day, right? So here I've kind of just highlighted sample control, some endpoint, network, web app firewall, but we could have a long list of whether it be for SIM or network gateways or whatnot. But what are those common control gaps you see in this our sample of endpoint, network, and WAF?
Yeah. So by talking lately with my customers, I think the signature-based malware, I think it's something that it has been a very frequent conversation I have, because customers would like some sort of a early detection of the malware. So they would like to know if something hits the disk. They would like to know if it's malware, if it's not, and stop the attack as early as possible, right? So I even have an example where one of my customers didn't have the notifications for signature-based attacks or even detections, and they were focusing mostly on the behavior-based ones, of course, because of ransomware and other Trojan horses and everything. And so they didn't have they didn't know the exposure they had with those signature files. And once they enabled those notifications based on all the assessments that were executed, right? And we make sure that the controls were generating the alerts, and it will really help and decrease the number of unattended alerts, and even improve the detection. So looking at lateral movement also is something that you have to use strong passwords, because for lateral movement you have to escalate privileges and then use those weak passwords, cracked passwords, and then reach your crown jewels, your domain controller, or even database servers. So it's really important to make sure that you're following the best practice also in credentials. URLs, we know that we have a lot of active phishing campaigns and command and control, where the attacker takes control and send additional files to your machine that is compromised. So you might have to make sure that you're blocking all those URLs. You have on your firewall, on your proxy, you have those feeds updated. And I think web application firewall, this is the servers are exposed to the internet, and they are being hammered by DDoS attacks with botnets, and even the most common one, the cross-site scripting attacks. So the WAF is a really important to make sure that none of these attacks go through, and then it creates a breach into your internal network. So,
I mean, for me, it just comes down to the fact of, you hired this control to do a job. Let's validate and make sure that it's doing the job. And quite often it's not, right? Some overlook, some default, some changing environment. The control is no longer performing what you hired it to do.
Exactly.
All right. So question number 2, or what your security control will never tell you is, hey, I'm not covering this, right? They're not going to highlight the gaps, and the idea that the control is going to know everywhere where it should be deployed, right, to the environments or different locations. And of course, my favorites always is when we see a development and staging environment that somehow goes into production, right? Again, the control is not going to know what's not covered, but this is what we see every day, right? This is the shadow IT. This is the aspect of just common deployment, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a really big challenge to understand your attack surface. New servers are, like I mentioned, coming in every day, and we're not talking about hybrid environments, even heterogeneous environments with different operating systems, and they're also on-prem, cloud, microservices, Kubernetes. So I have a lot of customers that are using Kubernetes for mission critical applications. So and they deploy new things, dev, QA, and you have to make sure that you're applying the controls and the best practices on those new deployed environments, and also making sure that these policies are some in some way standardized across different locations, different branch offices, or different teams, right, that manage those assets that you have exposed. So and also the monitoring, like I mentioned, the observability. So you have to make sure that you're watching and you're running the assessments and understanding what are the current gaps and what's different from what it was actually proposed in the first time, right? So
yeah, exactly. So if they're not going to tell you what's not covered, they're definitely not going to tell you what's changed, right? Whether you have a golden image and that golden image has changed, or you've deviated from that golden image, we would think that there's time and effort around, hey, best practices and change management, but we know things are missed, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I have an interesting story from one of my customers. So one of the security admins went on vacation, and when he came back, he saw that one of the risk scores was high, like from 3 or 4 to 90. So it was a huge increase in the. And then they found out that one of the admins that was on call had changed one of the rules to allow download from AWS buckets. So this was a rule that was already in place to not allow download the files from unknown sources or even the cloud. And then by running the assessments when he came back from vacation, he found that out, and quickly they fixed it and revert that change. So one thing that is also very important to mention is that sometimes the security teams are not invited to change management meetings or change management committees to decide whether the changes will have any kind of impact. So this is important to understand that any change could really impact your security risk and your exposure, and also can change. And if you're even under an audit, maybe, and you have to provide details on how you're testing your controls, and you have that kind of changes. So that's important to make sure that you're not changing anything that could impact so bad the score and the risk.
Okay, so I can either choose never go on vacation and hope nothing changes, or find an option that, hey, goes back and validates and finds the gaps, finds the drift, right? Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, next one would be the security control will never tell you I'm going to miss this threat. Okay, so you've put time and effort into tuning. You've put effort into trying to get the most out of the threat. What the threats do change. There definitely is control evasion. We don't know where the gaps are. And so how are you going to go test and test and validate against new threats and see what kind of threats can evade those controls?
Yeah, so these are very good examples, and one is that I like to highlight is the one that it's called EDR silencer. So when you're talking about the emerging threats and how to mitigate and even control what kind of bypass and evasion, you're probably thinking, well, the attack will try to kill the EDR, or it will try to somehow disable the EDR. But what this tool actually does is disable the telemetry. So the EDR will keep detecting if it's a new threat or if it's not detecting stuff, but will not report back to the server or the console what is going on that endpoint. So that's a brilliant way to evade the defenses by killing all the telemetry. And also what we recommend during our assessments for the IOCs that were mapped and they were tested during the assessment for the emerging threats. We call it like compensatory controls, where you can add file hashes, URLs, and other IOCs that were known to do some threat actors, and add those to the blocking list in a sort of a IOC management approach. And then even if you don't have a patch, but if somehow an attacker reaches your endpoint with that file hash or to access URLs, malicious URLs, you have at least the blocking of the IOC. So these threats really have evolved a lot with bypass techniques, and we have to make sure that even if they bypass, you have compensatory controls.
Great. So some key takeaways from the conversation we've had today would be, one, ignorance is not an excuse, right? You understand the fact that there will be security gaps. Validation is a way of doing some ongoing testing of what you have, how effective what you do have, and we're seeing this in compliance mandates, things like DORA in the EU. We see frameworks demanding ongoing testing and assurance of proof of effectiveness. NIST CSF2 has like new focus on improvement through continuous validation. And this other aspect here of so you deployed a new control, you factored in the cost of management, but validation should be included in that total cost of ownership. That total cost of management of that security control should factor in things like, how am I going to tune, manage, and optimize this control over time? How do I get the most value out of this control after I've made that purchase?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So that's a very good point. So I have a lot of customers that are under audits. They have to provide evidences and proof from compliance frameworks like NIST or CIS controls, and also if you're looking at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, where you map your exposure to the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures, under the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and of course, you need to have the visibility of that exposure, and how they map to existing TTPs or even other compliance controls. And so by running the continuous assessments and running security control validation, you'll be able to understand what exactly is your exposure and how your security controls were supposed to behave, and if they are behaving effectively.
Right. And this notion of ongoing security testing, keeping up with changes in the environment, keeping up with changes in threat landscape, it's really not possible unless you use some form of automation, looking for ways of how AI can be applied to keep pace with the speed of threats. So automation and the proven areas of AI value are definitely something we need to be looking at for security control validation.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so here's the shameless plug for Simulate. The role of security validation here is to continuously test and harden your defenses. You do this because the threat landscape changes. The best way of doing that is through attack simulation. Take that attacker's approach to test, harden, prove that security effectiveness. We've seen results. So a highlight of some of our customer results that Marcel can kind of talk to in greater detail. But if I summarize them, we talk about evaluating a new threat. You get that CISA alert, you get a threat intel about a new campaign, and be able to understand, are you impacted? Well, it may take 2 to 3 days for many organizations without automation. Our customers have seen, like, we can get that down to 1 to 2 hours through automation and the threat intel updates we provide in our product. For vulnerabilities, you've got a long backlog of vulnerabilities. How do you filter them down to what's truly exploitable? We have a customer case study talking about 60% increase in their efficiency of addressing vulnerabilities because they've been able to filter that on what's exploitable. For the aspect of just, you still need penetration tests. You're still going to have those audits and penetration tests for compliance and other reasons. But rather than having a once a year checkup and then have a long list of things to do, a continuous validation process helped this one customer reduce the number of vulnerabilities and findings by 70% in between their pen tests. So that the pen test report hits your desk with a little bit less of a thud. And of course, it's all about improvement. These last two stats here about how can we improve our risk posture, how can we improve the control. Marcel, you can really talk to the details here. It's really just about tuning and optimizing what you have, and oftentimes it's just a handful of things that need to be tweaked to maximize that value, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is the beauty of the security control validations, the results that we're getting, the feedback that we're seeing from our customers, and I think it's a joint effort when running the assessments, and then we invite the red team, we invite the blue team, we do purple team exercises, we look at the results, and like you mentioned, it's not like looking at the results like twice a year. We look at their results on a weekly basis. I have customers running assessments 3 times a day, depending on what exactly they are looking for and how the changes affect their environments. And what is interesting is that we review the results, and then we find ways of how we better to mitigate those what you're exposed, and what are the rules that you have to apply, custom rules, even detection rules for other products. So we sometimes we even talk with some of the EDR and XDR providers and do a really roundtable discussion on how to best mitigate. And at the bottom line, making sure that we have a solid remediation plan, and we keep monitoring exactly how those security controls are, the results and the score, everything is close to what the baseline or what the business has defined, right? So it's a really continuous effort with a lot of different teams, and we touch a lot of different points in the customer's network and other products as well. So it's really a joint effort and a continuous work.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the MDR, the Managed Detection Response, or MSSPs, because we've seen, say the evolution of, say, security validation 3-4 years ago. It was maybe used as a gotcha of like, hey, let's go test and validate and surprise the MDR provider of, hey, do you have the coverage I'm expecting? I think now we're seeing the MDR providers are oftentimes using this internally to test and optimize, right? They are definitely part of our customer base, and they're using security validation to test and validate. But it's also the partnership of whether it be a enterprise says, hey, these are the threats I care about. I'm going to run the simulations. I'm going to validate that. I'll work with the MDR provider to say, these are the mitigation rules. These are the detection rules that could need to be directly applied to whether it be an endpoint platform, a SIM platform, or the MDR's overall platform. Improve that, whether that be detection or whether that be prevention, and you're working together to prove that effectiveness. And I think there's definitely a stickiness there when it comes to that partnership, where you have the organization, the enterprise feeling more in partnership with the MDR provider, and the MDR provider has more of a partnership integration of, this is how I'm getting better every day, showing that when they come together with that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I have customers using control secure the simulations to test even on POCs for new EDR, MDR solutions, and how they behave against the same execution. So when you're running automated executions, so automation is key when you're talking about continuous control, and using a simulate to test different products to decide and make a good decision which one to go with the purchase. Mm-hmm. So it's being used as a centerpiece for deciding which tools will be purchased and acquired in the next couple of months. So
yeah. So in our conversations, you've kind of talked a lot about, say, the attack simulations. How would you describe the difference of those attack simulations versus atomic red teaming? Are they how similar? How different is the different approach? How do you best describe that?
So when you're looking at the executions, we have specific ways of running those executions to mimic the way what the real attack would look like. So there's a different approaches of running specific modules, specific vectors, and then combining and looking at something like a full kill chain, where you can see end to end from just like the initial testing and then until the end of the attack with some objectives or exfiltration data. So I think it's really important to understand what the use cases the customer is looking for, and also how you want to address real attack scenarios during the simulations.
All right. Okay. Well, we're coming up with about the end of time. Marcel, thanks again for sharing your insights. I always love hearing the real stories of what it takes to identify a gap and fix those gaps. If you're interested in learning more about security validation, I encourage you to check out a couple of other resources. There's an ebook here and another webinar. I think these resources will be in the links available to you after this webinar. So we want to say thank you for joining us today. Marcel, thanks for your time. And again, if there's any questions you have, any follow-up you'd like to learn more about Simulate or security validation in general, please reach out. We're glad to be a resource for you. Marcel, everybody, thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you all that joined us today. See you soon.